Salutations everybody, it is Matty here today, and it appears that we're getting into a bit of a Mass Effect rhythm as of late. Another week, another big Mass Effect Legendary Edition news update. This time it's less about the gameplay and more about the graphical enhancements and changes coming to this Legendary Edition. Some changes people are going to be really pleased with, but I also feel like there are some in particular that folks aren't going to like. Actually, we're going to be getting into Eden Prime in this video. This is one of the more controversial points when Mass Effect Legendary Edition was first revealed to the world and we saw new gameplay, new screenshots. A lot of people didn't like those changes, even if they were more lore friendly. So we're going to get into some of the reasoning behind those changes, as well as what's happening throughout the entire trilogy itself. So if you're new here, you like Mass Effect, we're going to continue to churn that out in the most thorough fashion we know how to do here on the channel, which is like 20+ minute updates. Of course, going over absolutely everything that's happened since our last update. So if you like that and you want guides, playthroughs, and so on and so forth when the game goes live, this is your place to be, the RPG home. And with that, let's go ahead and get things started with a little less about that BioWare blog and an update that happened between the two updates that we've talked about here on the channel. And that is Mac Walters, project director, confirming on his Twitter account Mass Effect Legendary Edition has gone gold. It's been quite a journey. Time to celebrate briefly, maybe even dance a little, if that's your thing. So this is great news, of course, because it means that more than likely the game is going to hit that launch date. Normally, in usual circumstances, we'd sit here and go, it's confirmed, it's happening, May, it's the set date, discs are being printed now, we're going to get those physical copies, it's going to happen. Cyberpunk happened, and now it's shown that even when you go gold, it can get delayed. I trust, though, with how many times this game did get delayed internally, as we reported on this since the beginning of last year in like February, that it's more than likely going to be okay. Like, Mass Effect Legendary Edition will indeed release in May. So just know it's gone gold, discs are being printed, and here we go. Let the journey begin. Also, big congrats to the BioWare team who's been seemingly busting their ass on this game. It looks fantastic, and I cannot wait to play. Now, let's shift our attention to some of the more relevant news for this video, which is the visual changes. So all of this is accompanied by a brand new trailer, the official remastered comparison trailer. And it's here that we can see a lot of shots from the original games combined with their remastered looks. And like I said, some looking better than others, so you can of course feast your eyes on this trailer. I'll have it linked in the description down below. We'll be playing it throughout this video though, but you can take a look at this trailer and sort of decide for yourself what you like, what you dislike. Now throughout this video, we're going to have some screenshots in particular highlighting changes that they're going to talk about in this blog, highlighted at specific points, and I'll give my opinion on some of these graphical changes, because for the most part, I like them. But there are a couple that you can sort of see there's something lost in the transformation. I almost said translation, but there's something lost there, and we'll get into that. And I think it's because Mass Effect was created with a very particular art style. But for now, let's start off by reading the article. I hopped around this a little bit. I do recommend reading the full thing. It's a bit of information on the actual development of a remaster and what it takes to resurrect some of these games. But of course, I know a lot of you just want to get in here for the game information. So do know there's more, but I'm focusing mostly on the game. For those interested in the technical aspects of game development, it's probably no surprise to hear that changing almost any asset of a system can and will break something else. When a game is in its final state, it generally resembles a house of cards. The simple process of blowing the dust off, let alone implementing foundational changes like updating the version of the engine, will undoubtedly cause unexpected issues. Remastering a single game is a deceivingly complex process, so creating a proper plan for how to best mitigate risk while opening 3 games to full development was foremost of our minds. We took a 3-phased approach to remastering the trilogy. The original trilogy was released entirely on a console cycle that allowed up to 1080p resolutions, but was often actually running at 720p or lower. Now, the remaster is on hardware that allows 4K resolutions. So, the answer for how many textures we wanted to improve was easy. Every single one of them. Yeah, puff your chest out on that one. For the trilogy, there is well over 30,000 individual textures that they had to improve. So know that some of this was, of course, done through AI. It's not like one person or a group of people went through 30,000. And that's not me like crapping on their work. I just want people to know that's why these types of things become more feasible, and why we're seeing games become easily upscaled, just because of AI and the progress it's making. And so we see some of those shots where improvements have been made. And I'm going to use this shot of Captain Anderson, which is one that I saw a lot of fans going back and forth on. The left is, of course, the original, while the one on the right is the remaster. Now, what you're seeing here is in the original, Mass Effect was very much saturated with a lot of contrast, right? And while that had its own feel, what I like more is on the right in the Legendary Edition, where you can see Anderson's wrinkles, you can see his creases, there's more detail in his eyes, he looks more lifelike. To me, that speaks more because Mass Effect is a series that, while it's very much future-based, tries to ground itself in reality. So when you have this art style that sort of looks almost pastel with, like I said, deep colors and a lot of contrast, I found it distracting. And this is high school Maddie talking, right? It's been a while since I played Mass Effect, so if I felt that way, I'm sure that would carry over, and it did to some extent. Was it enough for me to be distracted while making significant choices and having fun in the multiplayer? No. But point being is, I like the new approach here. Some people were not a fan of this because what happens is, since there were so many deep colors and there was so much contrast, it looks washed out when it's really, in my opinion, cleaned up. But it's all up to interpretation. That's what art's all about. You can even see that here, where the original Mass Effects were just dark. I mean, look at the difference here. I mean, it looks washed out because you see more grays compared to the darker grays and blacks that are in the original. But in my opinion, it looks way better in the Legendary Edition because you can see what the hell's going on. At the time, we also incorporated some more modern texture compression techniques that would allow those textures to hold on to more of their quality on disk. Meanwhile, our programmers were hard at work upgrading our version of Unreal Engine 3 to a more updated and unified version. With the game playable again and a much higher base resolution to work from, we began to improve assets by hand. So yeah, for those who don't know, this was something that was confirmed early on when we were talking about details with Mass Effect Legendary Edition, but they could not port this game over to an entirely new engine. So this is all being done on an improved version of Unreal Engine 3, which I think is more interesting on a tech feat level. Nothing crazy that's going to blow your mind or you're going to notice underneath the hood, but just something there. Now, this is where they focus in on the original Mass Effect. Eager to dig in, we started off where we knew the biggest improvements were needed, the original Mass Effect. Some assets, most frequently characters and generic props, were shared between the games, and many had already been improved in a later title or DLC. For those cases, we generally used the improved asset as our base and improved it further, then ported it across the whole trilogy. This resulted in more consistent and higher quality assets, but we had to carefully ensure this process didn't flatten the sense of the passage of time and the overall narrative. For characters who appeared in all three games like Liara, Garrus, Kaidan, see, even though I don't like the guy and I disrespected him by saying his name wrong, I got it right for all of you down in the comments below, Captain Anderson, and more, we maintained slight changes throughout the trilogy as they aged, matured, or got hit by a rocket. Obviously, we couldn't let uniforms branded with SR2 sneak their way back into the crew of the Normandy SR1, and we still liked how the Alliance Admiralty uniforms became more militarized and sleek as the trilogy progressed, so we improved each version of those outfits individually. I like that they're being lore conscious with their changes, so I think it's smart to, for example, if you have an asset of a box in Mass Effect 3 that's already been improved, that you can take, improve even more, and then put it in Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3 and just reuse that. That's fine. That makes sense. But I like that when it comes to characters and outfits, those were done on a more individual level because that requires a more finer craft. We talk about Kaidan. I mean, my man looks like he's been through the ringer. All right, he's been having a rough time. So, you know, you got to take good care of this guy. These are the ones you have to delicately touch up. Our character artists worked their way through a prioritized list of hundreds of armors, creatures, characters, guns, and vehicles across the whole trilogy. They would frequently take an asset back to the original high poly sculpt, focus on achieving a consistent texture resolution, adding supporting 3D geometry where needed, and fix errors with baked normal maps or texture mapping. Central to our efforts was increasing the sense of realism in the surface response. While the games don't use physical-based rendering, we could still work with the textures and materials to ensure plastics, fabrics, and metals reacted to light in a more convincing way. Similarly, we dedicated a significant amount of time to improving skin, hair, and eye shaders across the trilogy, which you can see in many screenshots already. Our tech animators then reskinned, i.e. set each vertex to move properly when attached to an animated skeleton, each improved mesh, and imported it back into each game as needed. The particle effects artists were busy extending the length and smoothness of animations for things like, say, smoke and fire, while also adding secondary emitters to beef up the overall look of each effect. A fire might now have a secondary smoke trail and spark. Explosions fling chunks of rubble, and the muzzle flash of your weapons now subtly illuminates Shepard and their surroundings. New environmental particle effects were added throughout the trilogy to better enhance the mood and a space's sense of life. As many of you have already noticed, we also sharpened up and added secondary elements to the trilogy's iconic horizontal lens flare. I know the lens flare for some is a little bit questionable, although as I showed in one of our first big Mass Effect updates, that's sort of always been prevalent in even the originals. Just I think it got a little more exaggerated here because of the things being touched up, where once again, it's what I said about the saturation of colors, and then you sort of see that get depleted. It looks washed out when I think in reality it's cleaned up. Same thing kind of here where they're applying additional effects that are a little bit more noticeable. But for me, I don't want to say I'm an immersion freak, but as time goes on, like less and less to break me out of the game world. And so things like, hey, when Shepard shoots his gun, you can see the light maybe reflecting off his armor a little bit more, not realistically, but it's emulating that. To me, that sounds great. But what about cutscenes, right? There are plenty of cutscenes. How have they changed? Let's get into that. We also improved all cinematics across the trilogy. Whenever possible, we completely re-rendered the pre-rendered cutscenes in 4K. When it was not possible to recapture, we utilized as I said earlier, AI upscale program on the original uncompressed videos. In both workflows, we tweaked the color correction, added or composited additional details and visual effects, and even smoothed out some edges frame by frame so they didn't feel dated when compared to actual gameplay. Cinematic designers fixed dozens, if not hundreds of bugs that occurred in live action cutscenes and conversations. Don't worry though, the "what did you just say" head spinning meme still exists if you know how to look for it. Give me more of this, BioWare. I don't know what happened, but give me more of this, BioWare, because every step of the way with Mass Effect Legendary Edition, all I felt like is they get it. They get it. They understand. They get it. You know, for example, when you make these art changes, that they're being lore conscious, I have never seen that really. You know, a lot of people are just going, update it, it's good, you're going to accept it. But this level of explanation, holding memes in place that they understand are valuable in a comedic way to their community, that's awesome. I adore that. So please give us more of this, BioWare. You know, give us more of the transparent, understanding, in touch BioWare. I'm not saying that this game's gonna be perfect. I'm sure people will tear this thing apart for how it looks differently on an artistic level at some point in time. I mean, it's the internet, it's literally bound to happen. But when it comes to their communication level and their understanding of their audience, it's really been on point, I think, the whole time throughout this marketing campaign. So talking about bugs, during this phase, environmental artists completed pass-throughs each level of the trilogy, performing targeted fixes on any asset or location that visually detracted from the overall experience. This included adding props to exceptionally barren areas so they're less empty, remaking low resolution or stretched textures, smoothing out jagged 3D assets, and modernizing shaders on surfaces with poor lighting response. At this point, we also began resolving hundreds of bugs, from minor things like floating assets to major game-breaking collision issues, including a very frequent global issue where players could easily teleport on top of assets and become completely stuck. We made systemic upgrades to shadows and added or improved post-process effects such as a screen space ambient occlusion, anti-aliasing, and bokeh, I may be saying that wrong, depth of field, increasing the cinematic quality for out-of-focus cameras. We were also able to bring down engine features that existed in Mass Effect 3, such as dynamic volumetrics, to help unify the look for the first two games. This was one of those moments I was talking about where I said that, hey, this may be an image that you look at and don't like as much. At least that's how I feel. I don't want to project too much, but this is one of those moments where it does look washed out. It does look not as enriched. And once again, it's still that same technique I was talking about. It's just less saturation, less contrast, and we're seeing here in the Legendary Edition a much more, I would say, sharpened image, a much more clear image, but it's lost a lot of its colors. So the computers in the background maybe lose what I would say is, for a lack of better terms, their sci-fi feel. You don't see the big glowing yellow screens in the backdrop of this conversation. And so I think it maybe hurts things a little bit if that's your perspective, because in my case, I don't like this image as much, but I'm sure the ones I explained earlier, like Captain Anderson, there are people out there who, as I said, don't really like that. Now, they also changed some of the levels and how they're presented, and here's a time where I think it looks pretty good. To guide this effort, we compared the levels we shipped to their original concept art, so the original idea. Once again, kind of true to the original. I like this. Design intentions and artistic inspiration. We also took dozens of screenshots of our currently up-res levels and sent them over to Derek Watts, the Mass Effect trilogy's art director, who used them as a base for new concept art paintovers. These broad brush adjustments were much faster to work on in a professional photo editing software. So as we can see here, this is one of the original locations from Mass Effect 1, and then here is the updated one, where I feel like this is still maintaining that level of atmosphere, right? It doesn't look like it's a good place to be in. It's not as dark as, say, the original, but you can still see some cracks of light crawling in. And I think if this is more true to their original vision, which is based off the concept art, then this excites me a lot more. And I think it looks better while still maintaining that feel. Same thing with Novaria, I believe this is, where I think this is another point in the game from Mass Effect 1 that is vastly improved when you take a look at the two, between lighting, illumination. It just doesn't look as dead as the original game. Eden Prime, however, this is where a lot of people have some more thoughts on the changes, because on one hand, it's more lore friendly. The fact that there was just a red sky hanging overhead doesn't really make sense on a lore level. It makes sense on a thematic level, and it makes sense to some extent due to the Sovereign, but in the Legendary Edition, they've cleaned that up and matched it more along the lines of what we saw from the Ashes in Mass Effect 3. So here's how they describe their changes for Eden Prime. They say Eden Prime is the first location you land on in Mass Effect. It's described to you as a verdant paradise planet under attack by an unknown alien ship. But the site that greeted players didn't always align with that image, which I kind of thought was the point. Luckily, in Mass Effect 3 from Ashes DLC, which is of course included in the Legendary Edition, by the way, we revisited Eden Prime so we could incorporate its overall atmosphere and specific buildings. We moved the sun's placement so that the player's path forward is now illuminated by evening light, while the burnt red sky looms behind, punctuated by falling ash and tracer fire. We also improved the planet's surface with additional fire and battle damage, more foliage, and destroyed structures littering the crater Sovereign leaves behind. So that wraps up all of the information I have for you, but let's talk a little bit about Eden Prime, because this is one of those examples where you're having the lore overrule the art direction at a point where some fans don't like that, because there was once again that atmosphere, that feeling of, hey, we're about to encounter a very dangerous force here, and it makes sense that it doesn't look all sunshines and rainbows when you arrive there. I understand, on the other hand, how it could be unsettling that you have this cataclysmic event occurring as you arrive on a planet that's all sunshines and happiness. It kind of reminds me of Gears of War 3 towards, we'll just say, the end of that game, where you're on this beautiful island fighting one of your final battles, and you're like, what is going on? So, you know, I get that feeling on both ends, and I don't think it's going to disrupt things heavily, but there is something there I think is lost. At the end of the day, I'm not terribly upset about it. I just wish maybe they exaggerated those reds a little bit more that we saw in the original game, because I think that was important. I think that did something for a lot of people, and it makes sense why when you go back there, when this whole thing is over and you're heading there for From Ashes, it looks different. It clearly sells to the player this idea that time has passed, something that BioWare themselves said earlier in this article. So I feel like there might have been a misstep there. That's just my guess, but ultimately, just some very interesting visual changes there. I don't think everyone's going to be in agreement on these. Maybe I'm just being a little low on it, but I like the changes. I like what I saw overall. There are some I'm more thrilled about than others, but yeah, it's enough about me, man. Let's hear about all of you. What do you think of course, Mass Effect Legendary Edition's visual changes now that they're really pulling the lid off of that? What do you think of all of it? Let me know in the comments down below. Other than that, follow me on Twitter, follow me on Instagram. Those links are in the description down below. Big thank you to all the patrons, all the members who continue to support the hell out of the content here. I appreciate each and every single one of you, and I'll talk with you soon. Stay sexy, stay active. I love you all. Peace.